The sound of a gunshot pierced the air as Margaret Zeller clutched her infant daughter to her chest, her heart racing with terror. It was 1878 in the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, and she just witnessed the local marshal gun down her husband, a man she discovered too late was wanted in 3 states for robbery and murder. Now she stood alone on the boardwalk, a 22-year-old widow with a 3-month-old baby, no money and nowhere to go. "Madam," said a deep voice behind her, "you ought to get inside, there might be more trouble." Margaret turned to find herself looking up at a tall stranger, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Unlike the other men who'd gathered to gawk at the scene, there was something steady in his gaze, something that made her feel, for the first time since the marshal had called out her husband's name, that she might not be entirely alone. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the commotion. The baby in her arms began to fuss, tiny fists waving in the air. The man looked at her, then at the child, and finally at the growing crowd of whispers and judgment already forming around them. Margaret could hear snippets of conversation. "Outlaw's wife, probably in on it. What'll happen to that poor child?" Before anyone could say more, the stranger stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Zeller is my cousin," he announced clearly. "I'll be taking her and the child to my homestead outside of town." The town's eyes widened in surprise, but no one challenged him. Even the marshal nodded, seemingly relieved to have one less problem to worry about. "But I don't even know you," Margaret whispered as he gently guided her away from the scene. "Name's Quentin Lawson," he said quietly. "And right now, madam, you need someone on your side. Your child needs protection, that's all that matters." Margaret studied his face weathered from sun and wind, but kind eyes that couldn't hide a certain sadness. He couldn't be more than 30, with strong shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Quentin looked down at the baby, who had calmed at the sound of his deep voice. "Because that little one deserves a chance," he said simply, "and so do you." It was only later, as he helped her onto his wagon and gathered what few possessions she had from the room above the saloon, that Margaret realized this quiet cowboy had just changed her life forever and his own as well. The ride out to Quentin's property was silent save for the creaking of the wagon wheels and the occasional soft sounds from baby Emma. Margaret couldn't stop her mind from racing through the events of the past hours. Just this morning, Richard had kissed her cheek and said he was going to inquire about ranch work. She'd believed him, just as she'd believed all his stories about his past. Now she was sitting beside a stranger who'd claimed kinship to spare her public shame. "It's not much," Quentin said as they approached a modest cabin set against a backdrop of pines. A small barn stood nearby and a corral held 3 horses that lifted their heads at their approach. "But it's clean and safe. Mr. Lawson, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't impose. Perhaps you could take us to the next town tomorrow, and what would you do there?" he asked, not unkindly. With a baby and no money, Margaret fell silent. The brutal truth was that her options were severely limited. A young widow with an infant had few respectable choices in these territories. "Stay here until you figure things out," Quentin continued, pulling the wagon to a stop. "I've got a spare room." It was meant for. He stopped abruptly. "It's yours for as long as you need it." Inside, the cabin was indeed clean and surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall and simple but well-made furniture filled the main room. Quentin showed her to a small bedroom with a narrow bed covered with a colorful quilt. "This is lovely," Margaret said, surprised. "My mother made that quilt," he explained, "before she passed." As he stood awkwardly in the doorway, Margaret finally saw beyond the mysterious rescuer to the man beneath. His clothes, though worn, were neat. His manner was reserved but gentle. This was not a man accustomed to having a woman and baby in his home, yet he'd stepped forward when no one else would. "Mr. Lawson, Quentin, please." "Quentin, I don't know how to thank you," he shook his head. "No need, get some rest, we'll figure everything else out tomorrow." That night, as Margaret fed Emma in the quiet darkness of the little room, she wondered about the man sleeping in the main room. What kind of person invites strangers into their home on nothing but compassion? And what was he about to say about the spare room before he stopped himself? Morning brought the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Margaret dressed quickly and found Quentin at the stove, frying bacon. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said. "Thought you might be hungry." "Starving, actually," she admitted, adjusting Emma in her arms. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Something like anger flashed across Quentin's face. "Your husband didn't, Richard wasn't much for thinking about others," she said quietly. "I'm learning that more clearly now." Quentin nodded, then turned his attention to Emma. "She's beautiful," he said. "How old?" "Just over 3 months." Margaret hesitated. "Would you like to hold her while I eat?" The look of surprise on his face was almost comical. "I don't know much about babies." "There's not much to know, just support her head." Margaret gently transferred Emma to his arms, showing him how to cradle her. The sight of the tall cowboy holding her tiny daughter made something flutter in Margaret's chest. Emma looked up at Quentin with wide, curious eyes, then gave a tiny smile that made his entire face transform. "Well, look at that," he whispered. "She's smiling at me." "She doesn't smile for just anyone," Margaret said, sitting down to the plate he'd prepared. "She must sense you're one of the good ones." Over breakfast, they began to talk more freely. Quentin explained that he ran a modest cattle operation with the help of one ranch hand, a man named Tobias who lived in town but rode out daily. "Been building it up for 5 years now," he said. "Started with just 10 head and worked my way up. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." "And you're out here alone?" Margaret asked carefully. A shadow crossed his face. "My wife, Sarah, died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our unborn child." Margaret's hand instinctively went to his. "I'm so sorry." "That's why I have the extra room," he continued, looking down at their joined hands. "It was meant to be a nursery." The revelation hung in the air between them, a shared understanding of loss that needed no further words. "Tobias will be riding in soon," Quentin said, gently pulling his hand away. "He's going to have questions." "What should we tell him?" Quentin considered this. "The truth, I suppose, that you needed help and I offered it. Tobias isn't one for gossip." True to Quentin's word, Tobias turned out to be a weathered, taciturn man in his 50s who asked few questions and seemed to accept Margaret's presence with nothing more than a tip of his hat and an offer to bring supplies from town when needed. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Margaret took over the cooking and household chores, insisting it was the least she could do in exchange for shelter. Quentin worked from sunrise to sunset, but always made time to sit with her and Emma in the evenings. To Margaret's surprise, he seemed to genuinely enjoy the baby, often holding her while Margaret prepared dinner. "She's getting stronger," he commented one evening, letting Emma grip his finger. "Look at that hold." "She likes you," Margaret said, watching them from the stove where she stirred a pot of stew. "Her face lights up when you come in." Quentin smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his serious face. "It's nice having you both here," he admitted. "The cabin was too quiet before." As weeks turned into a month, Margaret began to worry about the future. She couldn't stay forever, living off Quentin's charity. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with dread. Not just because of the uncertain future she and Emma would face, but because she'd grown accustomed to Quentin's quiet strength, his gentle ways with her daughter, and the peaceful evenings spent in conversation. Her chance to broach the subject came unexpectedly. A fierce spring storm had blown in, keeping Quentin and Tobias close to the buildings all day. After dinner, with Emma asleep in her makeshift cradle, Margaret found the courage to speak. "I've been thinking it's time Emma and I moved on," she said, watching his face carefully. "We've imposed on you long enough." Quentin looked up sharply from the piece of tack he was mending. "You're not imposing. I have no way to pay you, no way to contribute beyond housework." "That's more than payment," he said firmly. "Having meals ready, a clean house to come back to," he stopped, looking embarrassed. "What I mean is, you don't have to go." Margaret twisted her hands in her lap. "But what would people think? A single woman living with a man she's not related to." "We could say you're my housekeeper," he offered quickly. "If anyone asks, people will talk anyway. They always do." Quentin set aside his work and looked directly at her. "Margaret, where would you go? What would you do?" She had no good answer. The truth was, beyond this cabin and this man's protection, the world held few kind options for a woman in her position. "Stay," he said softly. "At least until Emma's a bit older. Until you have a plan." His eyes held hers, and Margaret felt something shift between them, something that had been building day by day. It wasn't just gratitude she felt for this man. It was something deeper, something that frightened her after the disaster of her marriage to Richard. "All right," she whispered. "We'll stay, for now." The relief on his face was palpable, and Margaret wondered if perhaps her feelings weren't entirely one-sided. Spring brought new calves and long days of work for Quentin. Margaret found herself watching for his return each evening, enjoying the way his face softened when Emma reached for him. The baby was growing quickly, sitting up now and beginning to babble. "Da da da," Emma said one evening as Quentin entered, her little arms reaching toward him. Margaret froze and Quentin stopped in his tracks. Neither spoke for a moment, the baby's innocent words hanging in the air between them. "I'm sorry," Margaret finally said. "She doesn't understand, it's all right," Quentin said, though his voice sounded strained. He crossed the room and lifted Emma as he always did, but there was something different in his manner. Later, after Emma was asleep, Margaret found Quentin on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. "I need to tell you something," he said as she joined him. Margaret's heart clenched. Was this it? Was he finally going to ask her to leave? "I've been thinking about Emma calling me that," he continued. "And about what happens when you both eventually leave." Margaret waited, her breath caught in her throat. "I don't want you to go," he said finally, turning to face her. "Either of you?" "Quentin, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it hasn't been long, I know you're still healing from what happened with your husband, but these past months with you and Emma here," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "This cabin feels like a home again. You've brought life back to it, back to me." Margaret couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. "I'm not proposing," he added quickly. "Not yet. That wouldn't be proper with you still in mourning, but I wanted you to know that I care for you both deeply. And when the time is right, if you felt the same way." "I do," Margaret whispered, finding her voice at last. "I've tried not to, it seemed too soon, too complicated, but I do care for you." Quentin's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and strong. "Then we have time," he said. "Time to be sure." The touch of his hand seemed to seal a promise between them, unspoken but real. Summer arrived with blazing heat and the unexpected appearance of Margaret's older brother, Mason. He'd tracked her down after receiving her letter explaining Richard's death. "I came to bring you home," he announced, standing stiffly in Quentin's cabin. "This arrangement isn't proper, Maggie." Margaret glanced at Quentin, who had retreated to the corner, his face unreadable. "This is our home now, Mason. Quentin has been nothing but honorable." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Has he, a single man taking in a beautiful widow and her child? The town's already talking." "Let them talk," Margaret said firmly. "Quentin saved us when no one else would. He's been a father to Emma when her own failed her." "And what exactly are his intentions?" Mason demanded. Before Margaret could answer, Quentin stepped forward. "My intentions are to marry your sister, sir, when she's ready, if she'll have me." Margaret's heart leapt at the words, spoken not as a question to her, but as a declaration to her brother. Mason looked between them, clearly surprised. "Is this true, Maggie? Do you want to marry this man?" Margaret moved to stand beside Quentin. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Mason stayed for 3 days, watching the interaction between Margaret, Emma, and Quentin with increasingly less suspicion. Before he left, he took Margaret aside. "He's a good man," Mason admitted. "I can see that now, but don't rush, Maggie. You made that mistake once." "This is different," Margaret assured him. "Quentin is nothing like Richard, I hope so, for both your sakes." Mason kissed her cheek. "Write to me. And when you do set a date, I want to be here." After Mason's departure, things changed subtly between Margaret and Quentin. There was an acknowledgement now of where they were heading, though neither rushed to define exactly when. As autumn approached, bringing golden light and cooler days, Margaret noticed Quentin growing preoccupied. He spent long hours in the barn and made several trips to town without explanation. When she questioned him, he merely smiled and said he was working on a project. The mystery was revealed on Emma's first birthday. Quentin led Margaret to the barn after breakfast, insisting she bring Emma along. "Close your eyes," he instructed as they reached the barn doors. Margaret complied, holding Emma securely. She heard the doors creak open, felt Quentin's hand gentle on her back as he guided her inside. "All right," he said. "Look." Margaret opened her eyes and gasped. In the corner of the barn stood a beautifully crafted wooden cradle, large enough for a growing child. "Quentin, it's beautiful," she breathed, running her hand over the smooth wood. "That's not all," he said, leading her around the cradle to reveal a small chest of drawers, also handmade with delicate carvings of flowers along the edges. "I've been working on them whenever I could steal a moment," he explained, "for Emma's birthday, and—" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. Margaret's breath caught as he withdrew a small, simple gold band. "I know it hasn't been a full year since Richard," he said softly. "If you want to wait longer, I understand. But I love you, Margaret. I love Emma as if she were my own. I want us to be a family officially." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she looked at the man before her, this quiet, honorable cowboy who had stepped forward when she needed someone most. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Quentin." Their wedding was a simple affair held in the town church 2 weeks later. Mason returned as promised, standing proudly beside his sister. Tobias served as Quentin's best man, his weathered face unusually cheerful. Even the townsfolk who had once whispered about the outlaw's widow seemed to approve, won over by the obvious devotion between the couple. Emma, dressed in a new white dress, sat contentedly in Tobias's arms during the ceremony, occasionally babbling da-da and reaching for Quentin, making the congregation chuckle warmly. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Lawson, you may kiss your bride." Quentin's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and Margaret felt her heart swell with a happiness she'd never expected to find again, especially not in the aftermath of such tragedy. The celebration afterward was held at the cabin, which had been decorated with wildflowers by the women from town. As the guests mingled and enjoyed the food, Margaret found a moment alone with Quentin on the porch. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "When Richard died, I thought my life was over. I never imagined that day would lead me to you." Quentin's eyes grew serious. "When I saw you standing there with Emma, something just clicked inside me. Like I knew instantly you were meant to be here with me." "You saved us," Margaret said softly. "No," Quentin corrected, drawing her closer. "You saved me. This place wasn't a home until you came. It was just somewhere I existed." As the sun set over the hills, casting long golden shadows across the land they now shared, Margaret reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. One moment of courage, one man stepping forward before whispers could destroy her, had changed everything. Later, after the guests had gone and Emma was asleep in her new cradle, now moved into the cabin, Quentin took Margaret's hand and led her outside. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "I have one more surprise," he said, guiding her toward the barn. Inside, a lantern was lit, illuminating something covered with a blanket. "What is this?" Margaret asked as Quentin pulled away the covering to reveal a wooden sign. "Lawson Family Ranch," she read aloud, her fingers tracing the deeply carved letters. "Oh, Quentin." "I figured it was time to make it official," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just my place anymore, it's ours. Yours, mine, and Emma's." Margaret turned to her husband, this man who had become everything to her in less than a year. "I love you, Quentin Lawson." "And I love you, Margaret Lawson," he replied, gathering her into his arms. "You and our daughter, our daughter." The words filled Margaret's heart with joy. Emma would grow up never knowing the truth about her biological father. She would know only love, security, and the steady presence of a man who had chosen to be her father when he had no obligation to do so. As winter settled over the ranch, bringing peaceful evenings by the fire and the cozy intimacy of their new life together, Margaret often thought about that fateful day in town. How close she had come to a very different fate. How one man's step forward had changed everything. One snowy December evening, as they sat before the fire, Emma asleep in Quentin's lap, Margaret shared news that brought tears to her husband's eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "By summer, Emma will have a little brother or sister." The joy that transformed Quentin's face was something Margaret knew she would remember forever. This child would be born into a home already filled with love, a home created not by blood or obligation, but by choice and courage. 5 years later, the Lawson family ranch had prospered. The cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Emma, now 6 and the image of her mother, Thomas, 4 with his father's serious eyes, and little Sarah, named for Quentin's first wife, just learning to walk. On the anniversary of their wedding, Quentin took Margaret to the hill overlooking their property. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over the land, the cabin, the barn where 3 children played under Tobias's watchful eye. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder. "That day in town when you stepped forward," Quentin's arm tightened around her. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let you face that alone." "One moment of courage," Margaret mused. "That's all it took to change everything." "The best decision I ever made," Quentin said, turning to kiss her softly. "Stepping forward before anyone could whisper was easy. The hard part was waiting for you to fall in love with me." Margaret laughed. "I don't think it took as long as you imagine." As they stood together, watching their children and the home they'd built, Margaret silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought this quiet cowboy to that street on that terrible day. In the darkest moment of her life, he had offered not just shelter, but a future filled with love. And that, Margaret knew, was the greatest gift anyone could receive, a second chance at happiness, born from one man's courage to step forward when it mattered most.